Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
In 1969, the world was an incredible place in which to live. Not only had science put men on the moon, it was busy making outrageous new toys. It was impossible to keep up with the pace of change. But Brett and I had a secret weapon. Our dad was in the world of advertising, and he was involved in all kinds of new and exciting stuff. He knew what was coming and when, and that converted into big bragging rights at school. We had the future, you didn't. It was, when I think about it back now, the ultimate in kid cred. Through Dad, we would know when a new flexible skateboard was about to land. There were yo-yos too, plastic ones with Coke and Fanta logos, mini bikes and battery-powered cars, toy trains with sleek green bodies, CB radios, remote-controlled helicopters that could actually fly. Television in colour had arrived in America. They were all coming, and Dad was a forecaster, perhaps the harbinger of it all. Even a 6-year-old could feel the buzz of living in the age of Aquarius. Some outrageous people were even wearing purple clothes. I was told by a very cool older girl that the colour was actually mauve. All over the world, hair was growing, on heads and faces and other places too. You knew exactly who believed in freedom just from the state of their hair. Cool was hairy, cool was hirsute, cool was tangled, messy and free.
Adam Courtenay is a Sydney-based writer and journalist. He has had a long career in the UK and Australia, writing for papers such as the Financial Times, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Australian Financial Review, and the UK Sunday Times. He is the son of Australia's best-loved storyteller, Bryce Courtenay, and the author of several Australian histories, including The Ship That Never Was, 3 Sheets to the Wind, and Mr. Todd's Marvel. Today I'm talking to Adam Courtenay about his memoir, My Father Bryce. Adam, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Your memoir begins in 1969 with you and brother Brett waiting expectantly at a Watsons Bay beach for your father Bryce Courtenay to deliver much coveted banana paddle pops. Your description has the hallmarks of an idyllic scene from childhood. Was it so idyllic?
Yeah, I have to say it was. I mean, I really had a very, very good childhood. I grew up in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and those people who know that area will know that it is pretty salubrious. I went to a very good school, quite well known, called Cranbrook. I had all the advantages. We lived in a little cul-de-sac called Desmond Avenue. It was right next to Watsons Bay, which is a wonderful little fishing village, and it was just a tiny little beach called Gibson's Beach, just 3 minutes walk. We used to run there, so probably 30 seconds if you ran, and it was just perfect. You could go there whenever you wanted. You just run down there with your mates, and in those days, of course, of the 1960s, you didn't have to ask parents' permission. You just ran down to the beach. So yes, I had a very, very idyllic childhood. I was very, very lucky, and I've never forgotten it.
That delivery of the paddle pops came with a bit of a twist.
Yes, we knew that the banana paddle pop at some point was coming out, and we pestered the local guys, a couple of Greek guys, Nick and Con, who lived in the local grocer, and that's where you got all your ice creams and everything. And I think we'd been pestering him for weeks and weeks. When are the banana paddle pops? Because the idea of a yellow ice block just hadn't happened, and it was all, as I say, bound up in this whole new colours coming out. Let's get to the twist. Bryce must have known when it was coming out, or maybe he'd had a talk to Nick and Con who told him when it was coming. And he knew that we were going to ask for paddle pops because they were the ice cream de rigueur of that time. And the twist was I think he must have counted how many kids were on the beach. So he got one for everyone, but he got one banana paddle pop for another kid, a kid that had been very badly neglected at school and everywhere else. He got it for Robert. Robert had severe disabilities. He couldn't talk. His entire body was twisted in a particular way. His arm, as I remember it, his hand, I should say, as I remember it, was curved. He couldn't really relate to us. But Bryce saw that, and he knew about Robert. He knew about Robert's disability. And he got Robert the first banana paddle pop. And I'll never forget, we were at first awestruck that he would give it to someone else. And then I went, oh my God, this is why I have the most fantastic dad in the world. He's given it to Robert. I knew Robert understood. I absolutely knew it. I just could feel it. And that's the twist. Bryce was always so incredibly generous and so kind, and always looking out for the person who had the least. And he did that throughout his life. It wasn't just a Robert. Robert was just the first time I ever saw it happen or remember seeing it happen.
Bryce Courtenay, of course, had an illustrious and well publicised career in advertising. For a man who created advertising icons like Louis the Fly and the Milky Bar Kid, his career still came with extreme highs and lows. How would you trace the contour of his career in advertising?
He started out in the big corporate. So he worked for McCann Erickson, which was second or third biggest in the country, and of course a big American agency. And that, of course, all come over to Australia. So the next one he worked with was J. Walter Thompson. When he came into the advertising, I think in the very late 50s, very early 60s, there weren't that many small advertising companies. There were a few, not to say that there weren't. But he worked for two of the biggest, which had some of the bigger campaigns to do. So he became very famous with those two companies. But I think towards the late 60s and early 70s, I think he got, for want of a better word, antsy. I think he got tired of working for an American company. I think he wanted to go out on his own. Unfortunately, he picked a time, and he couldn't have known this, nobody could have known this, when there was a fairly heavy recession. So he went out on his own. He formed his own with a couple of partners, and it was extremely difficult. There just wasn't money coming into advertising. I think a lot of the big clients were not putting in much money, and they only gave it to the big ones. So he kind of left the big companies, and it was very hard for a couple of years. I don't know how he scraped through. I really don't know. So he was sort of in the wilderness for 2 or 3 years, and then by I think about 76, started up with a small firm called Harris Robertson Courtenay, and I think things started to work for him again there. Very slowly, but he got into the gear, and I think that became a pretty successful, not incredibly successful agency, but enough for him to do well. And so by the mid to late 70s, he was back on course, I reckon.
And his rivalry, if I can call it that, with John Singleton is well known. How would you see it? Was it really rivalry?
I think there was a big difference. I think the thing about Singleton was he was very much his own man. I know he did work at some point. I don't know enough about his background, but I know he told me, because I had spoken to him, that he did work for J. Walter Thompson at some point, or one of the bigger firms. And I think the thing about Singo is he very much was one of the early guys to go out alone at a time, I think in the mid to late 60s, when it was more easy to do it. And he had an agency called Spasm. And I think Bryce and he had some sort of a bet. Bryce was in the sort of more comfortable corporate job with J. Walter Thompson, and Singo being a braggart, as my dad was too, let's be honest, that I think they had a bet of some kind saying, well, let's see who has the most billings by the end of 1968, I think it was. And each man to this day told me they won the bet. So I don't know who had the biggest billings or who got the most business that year. But it was mostly, through the years afterwards, a very friendly rivalry. Although I think there were some moments when it got a bit heated. But I think, when I met Singleton in the 80s, he had nothing but good things to say about my father. And I think they were friendly rivals, but then they kind of, there was rivalry, there was competition, but they kind of loved each other. They were both very different kinds of advertising men.
At this point, I think I'd like to remind listeners about one of John Singleton's iconic pieces of work. It was the "Where Do You Get It?"
Oh, yeah. Where do you get it? Grace Brothers, Carling. I can't say it. I just can't remember all the ones. All I remember from that is where do you get it? And then seeing dog food being thrust onto a plate and crushed up. And look, it worked. People loved the no-nonsense ads that Singo would put on the television. And, Bryce and him were sort of battlers, because Bryce was a great believer in print advertising, that you use very refined, wonderful, brilliant words to cut through. Whereas Singo was a television guy, and he wanted to cut through with images. So they were very, very different advertising men, but each with great talent in their various modes. But yeah, there was very much a TV versus a print thing going on there as well.
When did you first come to the realization that your father was a storyteller?
Oh, I think it was so very obvious from the start. Even as a kid, I mean, we're going back when I'm 4, 5, 6 years old. He used to have this funny little story, and he did it for all the kids, all of us. I don't know where it came or where it eventuated. It was a story about Mr. Wooden Spoon and Mr. Puppet. And not only did he tell the stories, we'd say, "Oh, Dad, tonight, can you give us a story about Mr. Wooden Spoon and Mr. Puppet in Wee Wee and Poo Poo Land?" And of course, he'd do it. One thing people don't know, he's a very good drawer. So he'd then draw a scene of Mr. Wooden Spoon and Mr. Puppet walking through Wee 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 and Poo Poo Land. And Blood and Guts Land was another very one that we wanted him to talk about. They're the two that I remember. But we'd ask him, and he would just start, and he could go for half an hour. He could just talk it through and giving 4, 5, 6-year-olds a very nice little story about Mr. Wooden Spoon and Mr. Puppet. And we then got to know their characters. Mr. Wooden Spoon was the really nice guy, and Mr. Puppet was a bit of a devil. So he created these characters there, and then we came to expect those characterizations to be like that. And he worked them out, and he moved it on. So he improved the stories as he went along and created situations. And he did it for the rest of his life, as far as I'm concerned.
Some of those stories were acted out on behalf of Damon, your brother now deceased. Damon coined the phrase dad facts. What are dad facts?
Oh, God, where do you start? There were dad facts that Dad told us were dad facts, and I never believed them. If he said it was a dad fact, then you didn't believe it. But then again, dad facts are just pure invention. He would say, well, did you know that Courtenay was this or Courtenay was that? As I said, there was a Courtenay, Robin Hood was one of the Courtenay family. That's a dad fact. The interesting thing I thought about dad facts was you can't disprove them. Anytime a dad fact came on, I always knew that you couldn't check them out. If you couldn't check them out, then they lived on as dad facts forever. You could never really get him because he was very smart with his dad facts. Make sure that they're uncheckable most of the time.
Let's talk a little bit about Damon. What was Damon's effect on family life?
Look, Damon, of course, was a hemophiliac. He was always the one we had to be wary of. I can remember situations where the whole family was hoping to go to an event, and then Damon had what they very simply called a bleed. It stopped it. The world had to sort of revolve around Damon and Damon's sickness. Not completely. I don't want to make it sound like Damon was stopping us from doing things, but we had to keep a constant eye on him. The difficult thing was, in those days, back in the 60s and early 70s, every time he had a bleed, and sometimes it was 3 times a week, sometimes even more often, he had to stay up all night. You had to wait for the hospital to open or the man to come in for the hospital. He had to be taken. So Damon was most beloved, funny, beautiful kid. He had to be looked after very, very carefully. There was an interesting thing that I heard this later. I didn't put it in the book, but when Damon came to a little kindergarten, the same kindergarten I went to up in Watson's Bay, the headmaster said, no one must touch or hurt Damon Courtenay. He must not be touched because the slightest thing would cause a bleed. And of course, being kids, I may have done things. I may have pushed him. Who knows? I can't even remember. And the funny thing is he wanted to be part of the hurly-burly, but, it just had such consequences. It put a very big weight on the family, and I think it put a very big weight on Bryce and Benita, my mother and father, but it got better as time went on.
In 1993, the book April Fool's Day was published, which talked about Damon's life. What was your reaction when you were reading the draft?
It was a mixed reaction. I thought this was such a beautifully written story and so correct about who Damon was and the difficulties we had with him growing up, all the things that happened to him as a hemophiliac and later as a sufferer from AIDS. I thought Bryce did a fantastic job, but the problem was Bryce was never, you could call them dad facts. Bryce would embellish things and he'd get times wrong. He'd often put himself as the person who saved the day. I disliked that because there were times when I saved the day or Brett saved the day or Mum saved the day and Bryce just neatly put himself in there. Bryce couldn't help but be the hero for these things. And that started to gnaw on me. And I didn't like the fact that Bryce seemed to be there for every little difficulty Damon had, and it wasn't true. So Bryce was embellishing, Bryce was changing the facts, and Bryce is very famous for doing this. And he also created characters, people that I knew that this weren't like the way he put it. He put them in for pathos. He put them in to make it a little bit funnier or make it a bit more interesting. And I don't think you can do that with nonfiction. You cannot change who a person was. You can interpret them. He created, for instance, a character called Sir Splatter Grunt. Now, that just didn't exist. But I think that Sir Splatter Grunt, which was this awful doctor who had the bedside manner of an executioner. This man was awful. And he had no tenderness for children. The person It was actually the head of the children's hospital at that time. It was a guy called, I believe, Sir Lorimer Dodds. It was actually the antithesis of what, and people saw Sir Sputter Grunt as a sort of affectation or a caricature of Lorimer Dodds. He wasn't. There's nothing in common. But I think Bryce put him up there as a revenge against some of the doctors that he was sort of an all doctor, an all unfeeling doctor that Bryce created. Now, I don't like creations in nonfiction. I don't think you can use fictional techniques. You can to some degree. There is ways of doing it, but not the way Bryce did it. Bryce simply created characters, or he distorted actual people and who they were and what they were. That weighed heavily on me because it wasn't necessary. The story had so much incredible pathos in its own way. But Bryce, he couldn't help just sort of jazzing it all up. It didn't need it to happen. And that's my beef, if you like, with April Fool's Day. And for instance, another person, Celeste, in it, always felt that she felt that he got her voice, I should say, very wrong. She sounded a bit like a baby, a kid, a 12-year-old. That's how it came across to her. And so he molded the characters like he would in a fictional book to make them more interesting in a non-fiction book, and he shouldn't have done it. I didn't take him up about it at the time. It's such a beautifully written book. The goods outweigh the bad by many, manifold. But there were things that sort of irked me, if you understand.
Clearly, Bryce had the power of invention, but he seems to also have had a power of reinvention, and that's with regard to himself.
Yeah, I've often believed that when Bryce set foot in this country from South Africa, or actually via England, he lost his accent, he lost his South African background, he didn't want to know about it. He'd talk about it in a sort of mythical, wonderful kind of way, but actually who he was and where he came from was, a mystery. I believe he reinvented himself and constantly reinvented himself. So first he was the ad man, and he was a top guy, and he was considered, the creative genius and this sort of thing. I think that began to pall for him. So what's the next thing? He became a sort of newspaper writer, and still an ad man, of course. He was constantly looking for the next thing that would get him towards becoming what he really always wanted to be, which was a fictional writer. And I believe he knew that to be a popular writer, you had to be a popular person, had to be known. So he used the newspaper articles that he did. He didn't use it as a way of advertising what he was going to do. But at the same time, there was a certain amount of stepping stones that would release him from the past Bryce into a new one. And the new one was going to be the world's greatest fiction writer. Now, whether he got there, I don't know, but he certainly became Australia's most popular one. And part of the importance of this book is to explain how a man reinvents himself, using what happens to become the next best thing. And he always thinks he was driving towards the better thing, which is to become a great writer, which in many ways you could agree that he did. This is about the subtlety of change and how he moved in increments towards what he wanted to be until he was ready at about the age of 56, 57 to be the big novelist that he became and wrote The Power of One.
You read the first draft of The Power of One around 1987. What was your reaction, and did you have any inkling of how successful it might be?
I read this thing and I said, oh my God. Within the first 2 or 3 pages, I knew that he had something formidable here. I just had an inkling about it. You got to remember, he'd been talking about this thing for 30 years with me. Bits and pieces he'd come out with. And that's also explained in the book how he progresses in that sense as well. I just felt inside, I didn't know anything, but I felt inside, and it kept on coming, and it came out like gushing out. And he was doing a chapter a day. And I think he probably did too much. He overwrote, but he didn't know quite what he was doing. But at the same time, I was just lapping it up. And so was my mother. And my mother was far more literate than either of us. She knew a good book, and she knew a book which worked. And we just said, this is going to be something. What it was, we knew it would be definitely published. It was just something about the ease of the writing and the brilliance of some of his descriptions of his life, and the way that the story moves on so beautifully. And everybody who read it just went, this is the bee's knees, including Jill Hickson, his soon-to-be agent.
The whole story of The Power of One revolves around this character called PK. With every first book, there's the question of, is it autobiographical? How did he feel those questions about it being possibly autobiographical?
Look, it depended on who he was talking to. Sometimes he'd say, "This is the absolute truth," and this is exactly what happened to me in my life. Other times, "Oh, it's a great exaggeration. It's a fictional book, and don't take it too seriously." The best way of explaining is it's PK was his avatar, his alter ego, what he would like his childhood to have been. Don't get me wrong, there are things about PK and Bryce that are very similar. As I understand it, it's very severely bullied. Whether he became a boxing champion through it or because of it is another story. Although I might add, I'm told, and I never saw it, that he was a very good boxer. But Bryce weaves in two ideas, and that's PK, the bullied little kid, being emasculated by big bad bullies, and using that as a way to become a great boxer and defender of the anti-apartheid faith, so to speak. I think it's what Bryce would have liked himself to have been, and plenty of it was taken from plenty of the aspects of PK were taken from his life, but the actual story is complete. Sorry to say it, BS.
You talked about the power of one as having gushed out, but it seems like the sequel, Tandia, didn't come out in the same way. It had a difficult birth. I think you used those words.
I was there for only the last part of it. He came to England because he was having, as I was told, but I was in England at the time, and he came and stayed for about 2 months, I think. Apparently, there was a lot of problems with the content. Both the Americans and the British felt I'm told this, there were two rape scenes. The first one starts at the beginning, and he wanted a second rape scene in there for whatever reason, I don't know. But he wanted a second rape scene in there, and they said, "No, you can't do that. We've had enough." This is probably a little more difficult times, at times when people were a bit more uneasy about these things, perhaps. I believe they kept on telling him, "This doesn't work, this doesn't work." Bryce said that the Americans didn't understand the African details, yet they published The Power of One with all the African details. So not sure that that is the truth. And let's remember, this was happening when my brother was extremely unwell. It may have been that his eye was off the ball, to be fair. But apparently the problem was not just that they didn't like some of the scenes, and they didn't like perhaps some of the language. It was quite heavy language, if I remember correctly, in Tandia. It was also very, very long, and I thought overwritten. But the real problem, I'm told, was that he just couldn't get the ending right. Now, it's funny that I should say that, because I would like to say the ending of Tandia, the last 20, 25 pages, is, in my mind, the best piece of Bryce Courtenay writing ever. That's my opinion. Nobody has to agree with me. I thought it was incredible. And how he got to that, having had problems apparently with the ending, it must have put a great deal of thought, and it must have been very hard to get it. But when he got it, I believe it was a magnificent piece of writing. I think the book as a whole is overwritten, but the ending is among the best, if not the best, he's ever written.
Let's talk about your mother, Benita. Apparently not a domestic goddess.
No, my mother was no domestic goddess at all. I think I describe it in the book as her thoughts were all tending towards being somewhere else. Not that she wanted to be away from her kids or even away from her husband. She's just the things that she loved in life were, she loved Europe, she loved travel, she loved books, she loved art, she loved cinema. She was a real arts maven before I think even that term was coined. And I think those are the things she truly loved in life. And just making the chops and chips as what you used to have in the 70s, and sausages and mash and salad. It wasn't in her purview, so to speak. She wasn't made for ironing clothes. I never saw her iron anything. She wasn't made for cleaning the house. She just wasn't made for these things. I think she tried to some degree to be as good as possible. I wouldn't say it was the cleanest household we grew up in. It wasn't. There was nothing septic about it, but it was just a little bit ramshackle, perhaps is the right word. And some people have said the same thing about it to me later on. They didn't want to say it to me then. But it could have done with a very, very good intensive clean. And when it was done, of course, it was those sorts of things were done by Bryce, not by Benita. I don't want to say she had her head in the clouds, because it makes it sound like she was off with the fairies, but she just had so many loves for so many different things, mostly in the arts, that she just couldn't put her mind to domestic chores.
She actually had quite a progressive outlook and a woman ahead of her time in a sense, particularly when we come to things like civil rights and social issues too.
My mother was the first person I've ever met that because nobody else was saying particularly nice things about people of a different color. But my mother loved them, especially Black Americans. She loved jazz. She knew all the stories about what had happened in the South. She knew more about Black Americans than she did about Black Australians, but that's normal because no one knew anything about what had happened to our Aboriginal people, our First Nations people. And she was very empathetic towards the downtrodden and those who had been given less than the best, as it were. She felt that Black Americans were among the most, well, she believed them to be the most brilliant people in the world. She had her prejudices mostly against white people of certain tribes, shall we say. She loved Africans as well, and she loved Black Americans, and she was a defender of them in every single thing. And also, let's not talk about, she loved Polynesians, she loved Melanesians, she loved, I don't like to talk in racial terms, but that's how she thought. The more exotic, the more she loved them. Let's put it that way.
With a man like Bryce Courtenay, women were a big part of his life. Of course, he was married to Benita, but that's not where it ended.
No, it's not. Bryce had a very long paramour, I think is a nice word to use it, a lady called Celia Jarvis, whom, funnily enough, I got to know pretty well over the years and whom I thought was a marvelous person. And she truly, truly loved Bryce. There was absolutely no doubt about that. Even as a kid, my mother didn't want to come to the footy games or watch me surfing or anything. But Bryce would come along and there would be his plus one, Celia. And I got so used to it, I never really thought much of it. But I knew it was wrong. I'm not going to say I didn't, but I wasn't going to tell my mother because it would have caused such consternation and I couldn't deal with that. I couldn't deal with my mother being so upset. So we kept it all of us are guilty of, and my brother as well, everybody. We all kept it under wraps. Here's the thing that I'd like to say, Celia being the other woman, so to speak, for 30 years, she was not just his secretary, paramour, she was a researcher, and she never got any kind of accolade. She did, I think, most of the researching for one of his best books called The Potato Factory. And she did it with April Fool's Day as well. And I think The Power of One, she was involved, and Tandia, and never mentioned. Why? Because she's the other woman. You don't mention the other woman. Bryce has never mentioned her, never dedicated anything. And I don't want her. One of the reasons I wrote this is that I don't want people like Celia to be consigned to the dustbin of history. She meant a lot to me. She meant a lot to him. She deserves to be added into this. I feel very strongly about this because I know that her feelings for my father were very strong, as much as my mother. And just this stuff happens, unfortunately. But I thought she was a beautiful person. And I don't want her to be forgotten.
There's a couple of phrases that come up that interested me with regard to Bryce. I think he's called, on one hand, a publicity genius and also a master propagandist. How do those two things work together?
That's a good question. The question, I think, is where do you become a master propagandist and when are you a great publicist? I think propaganda is a heavy term and it's usually used in the political side of things. I only use it here because I think you can be a publicist and say, I'm great, and I do this, and I do that. People will perhaps argue with me with this, but propaganda goes to the point where you're actually telling people things that aren't actually true. And Bryce had no problem with that. And so when I say he's a master propagandist, I can't remember the actual when I said that. It was more, I think, related to his reinvention. We talked about reinvention. He talked about PK, and he talked about all the things that he did. And he said, I was meant to go to Oxford, and I've done thousands of marathons, and I won 120 amateur fights. I can't remember the exact number, 138, I think. Well, is it publicity or is it propaganda? That's a question I don't know. So people can take me up on that. I would say it's propaganda because it's designed to make people believe in something that didn't exist. And that's where you can be a great publicist by using the facts or a propagandist by distorting them.
Adam Courtenay, thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
I've been talking to Adam Courtenay about his memoir, My Father Bryce. It's published by Hachette, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.